Hey, what's up? This is Yanni Lunga, and in this video, we're gonna look at some things to think about when it comes to choosing the right podcasts to be a guest on. In the last video, we looked at a few different reasons why you may want to be a podcast guest. If that's something you have been thinking about but aren't really sure on why you may want to do that, make sure to watch that video. Before you get started looking for podcasts, pitch yourself and so forth, you really have to take a moment and think about your goals. What do you want to achieve through podcast guesting? Do you want to position yourself as an authority, so you want to be recognized as the expert about a specific topic? Or perhaps you're more interested in connecting with people, you want to grow your network, or maybe you're a business person and you want to expand the reach of your network in your specific niche. Maybe you're somebody who really wants to leverage podcasts to grow your email list, or perhaps you're an entrepreneur, you're a business owner, and you have actual products and services you would like to promote to different audiences. Maybe you're an artist, you are a musician, or you are a photographer, and you want to just share your artwork with brand groups of people. Regardless of why you want to be a podcast guest, you always have to make sure to keep your goals at the back of your mind when it comes to choosing the right podcast. And that's because it's important for you to keep in mind that there are thousands and thousands of podcasts. So you don't want to spend your time and be interviewed on any podcast. You want to be featured on the right podcast. So now you may be wondering, Jan, what is the right podcast? Here's the thing. The right podcast is the podcast that brings you in front of your prospects, your ideal customers, or if you aren't a business person, the right podcast is the show that brings you and your message and what you do in front of your ideal audience. And you may think, well, I want to reach everybody, but if you really think about it, there is a specific group of people, a certain demographic, perhaps older people, younger people, male, female, people who live in a specific country, people who speak a specific language. As you start to think about those things, you're going to be able to define your ideal listener, the person you really want to tune into the show you are featured on. Once you have clarity on your goals, you have to think about the topic of the podcast. It goes without saying that if you're somebody interested in talking about, Twitter, for example, you ideally want to be featured on podcasts that talk about Twitter. You may be featured on podcasts that cover different topics, because I assume you aren't a person who simply lives and breathes Twitter. You probably have other interests, other things you do. So sometimes you may be doing interviews outside of that sphere. In my case, for example, I've done interviews where I've talked about podcasting, other interviews I've talked about virtual summits, in other interviews I've talked about traveling, languages, music. So you see that there may be different topics that you cover. So it's important for you to really keep in mind that the topic of the podcast matters. Because you invest time as a guest, you want to make sure that you're featured on podcasts that actually cover a topic you're familiar with. You wouldn't want to spend your time and start to talk about something that you don't know the first thing about. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm pretty sure that after hearing me talking about the importance of the topic of a podcast, you were like, well, I already know about the show or shows I should be featured on. Wait a second. Before you actually start pitching yourself, you want to make sure that the podcast has the right format. First of all, is it an interview-based show? You may be surprised by this, but actually there are many podcasts that aren't interview-based podcasts. So instead of trying to spend your time, or waste your time, I should say, pitching yourself to somebody who doesn't do interviews and perhaps trying to convince them to change their format, which isn't gonna happen, by the way. You want to make sure that you spend your time wisely. So you want to look at the format of the podcast. Is it an interview-based show? If so, what type of interview is it? Is it an open interview? Are there specific questions you hear the host asking the guests every single episode, or perhaps the questions vary depending on the topic or the guest. You want to make sure you know that. Perhaps is a round table discussion. So it's not just you and the host, but perhaps there are a couple of experts, a couple of guests. So you really want to make sure that you spend a moment to make sure that the podcast you think you're interested in actually has the right format. Now let's talk about the host for a moment. You know, the person you're gonna spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or even an hour with? Yeah, that person, the host. You're a guest and you're gonna be talking to somebody for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, depending on the format of the podcast and the duration of each episode. What you wanna make sure, again, before you start sending emails left and right, is that the host is somebody that gives you an impression of a cool person, somebody you would see yourself sit down with and chat for whatever the duration of the episode is. Imagine yourself, if you were to go out for a drink with this person, is he or she somebody you would see yourself spending time with, or even they, because they may be co-hosts, so there may be more than one host. If your answer is yes, great. That's a person or a couple of people you want to talk to. If you aren't sure, my advice would be move on to the next show, because people aren't stupid. So if there is a weird synergy going on during the interview, listeners are gonna notice that. And guess what? You being the guest means that you're gonna be the one that stands out, and not in a positive way, because the audience is used to the host and not you who are appearing on the show for the first time. This next point is a big mistake many new podcast guests especially make, and is focus on the big shows. You want to be featured on the most popular shows because you think that is gonna change your world. I hate to break it to you, but quantity doesn't equal quality. You want to focus on shows that have a quality audience, that have the ideal listeners, the ideal people tuning in. Because if you go and are featured on a show that has, let's say, 10,000 listeners, but only 10 of them are ideal, you may be better off being interviewed on a show where they have 50 listeners, but 47 of them are ideal listeners. You would get, or you're likely to get, over 4 times better results. So don't focus on the big shows, focus on the quality shows, the podcasts that are listened to by the people you're interested in reaching. And in addition to that, you have to keep in mind, especially if you have never been in front of a microphone before, is that even if you include a couple of big shows, quote unquote big shows, in the list of shows you want to be featured on, you want to leave those for later on. Think of yourself as a musician. I used a metaphor of music in the last video, and I want to bring a different metaphor, always about music. If you think about it, does a new artist or new band perform in front of a crowd of thousands of people or more? Typically no. Typically they start small. I'm not saying that you have to be featured on podcasts that they have 2 or 3 people tuning in. I'm not saying that, but I want you to keep in mind that it's about the quality, and you want to start, practice, and work your way up. So it's much better start with the low-hanging fruits, so that once it's time to be featured or to be on the big stage, to be featured on a popular podcast, you're gonna do a great job because you really feel comfortable in the podcast guest shoes. But if you do that as your first interview, you probably won't stand out that much, especially if it's a show that has featured hundreds of great guests before you. In terms of where to actually find podcasts to be interviewed for, you want to go where podcasters are. And as of today, the number one place for podcasters is iTunes. So I'm quickly going to show you how to navigate the iTunes store. The first thing you want to do is, you see here on the top right corner, you want to click and choose podcasts. So in case you see something different, perhaps you see music or something, choose podcasts. As you can see here, if we scroll down, we have New and Noteworthy. And New and Noteworthy, as the name suggests, highlights new podcasts. If we scroll down on the right-hand side, you can see top episodes, so the most popular podcast episodes of the last days. here top podcasts. And then we have some topics. You see daily news and so forth. So you can search for podcasts in a few different ways. You can click see all and see all of the new podcasts. You can click here all categories and choose a relevant category. So let's say education. Okay, now here we see different podcasts. The system, if you will, is always the same. Here we have the new and noteworthy, so the latest podcasts. If we scroll down, we see what's hot. On the right hand side, we have the top episodes, top podcasts, and so forth. So what you want to do once you've chosen a category, you can start browse and find the specific podcast, or you can even be more specific. Every category has a series of subcategories, and you find them by scrolling down. You see down here more education, educational technology, higher education, and so forth. And if you click on one of these, you are then redirected to the subcategory. So using the categories menu here is very powerful. An alternative way to search for podcasts is to actually use the search bar all the way to the top right corner. You can enter anything, a topic, keyword, the name of a podcast, or even the name of a guest. So if, for example, there is somebody in your space and you're wondering what podcasts they have been featured on, you can enter their name here. So if I were to enter my own name, for example, and then we scroll down, we can see the podcast. So the first results are my own podcasts, but if we scroll here, we can see a series of podcasts I've been featured on, and we can also click see all to see all of the podcasts. So iTunes is the number one podcasting platform, so I would personally recommend you use iTunes. An alternative could be take a look and browse through the podcasting app you may be using. Perhaps you're using something like Stitcher or Overcast or something like that. Feel free to browse through the app. Another thing you can do is actually look at your favorite blogs. If you read blogs or even you're subscribed to some newsletters, you can check their websites out and see if they have podcasts, and if so, if they have guests, and perhaps they have an online form or anyways instructions on how to be featured on the show as a podcast guest. And don't forget, it's always about your goals. Whenever you're torn between two podcasts, always keep the goals you want to achieve through podcast guesting at the back of your mind.